this early morning, though it's not very early, it's 10 o'clock, to Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. And Vilnius Institute of Policy Analysis for a few years already is engaged in different Ukraine-related projects. And one of the projects we want to present today is with our partners from very diverse countries. The leader of the project is Natalia Chaban, who is from Christchurch University in Canterbury. And the other partners are from UK, from Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And actually, we have today opportunity to give some insights and present some of the results of the project, which is called Youth Opinion Opportunities for EU Public Diplomacy, Youth Narratives and Perceptions of the EU and EU-Ukraine Relations in Ukraine and the three Baltic states. First, I would like to stress that Vilnius Institute of Policy Analysis, together with Natalia, we did already a large project which ended like approximately 1 year ago. And the project lasted for 3 years, and it was related to the conflict areas and perceptions of EU in these conflict areas. Primarily, this was related to Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. But these methodological insights, and especially insights into the Ukrainian question, were very interesting, controversial, and some of the results made us very cautious about the state policies towards Ukraine, and how the machinery and the state machinery, propaganda machinery is working on many issues related to Ukraine. But these are the questions related not only to the perceptions, but also to the role of the main actors in the field, those who try to form the positive image of Ukraine in the Baltic states. And primarily we are speaking about the state of Latvia, the state of Estonia, the state of Lithuania. And also there is element of Ukrainian participation, how Ukraine is projecting its own image abroad. But not going into much of the details, I want to pass the floor to Natalia Chaban. And Natalia will introduce more details.
Thank you very much, Sharunas. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming on this late morning of this very, very hot day. Summer is indeed still here, which is fantastic for somebody who is from New Zealand, because it means I'm escaping winter, and it's always good. I'm inviting all of you to do the same and escape your winter and come to our summer at any time. I would like to start my presentation with big words of gratitude to Vilnius Institute of Political Analysis, to Virginia and to Sharunas for being fantastic partners. They worked with us, as Sharunas mentioned, for more than, 3-4 years at this point. And it's been a delightful partnership, but it also has been very insightful, and very thought-provoking partnership. I'm very privileged that I am working with Vilnius Institute of Political Analysis, and I'm very privileged to work with Lithuanian partners as well as a multicultural team, which I will introduce literally in a couple of seconds. I am not going to steal too much time with the introduction because we have quite a variety of inputs, and we would like to hear your feedback, your comments, and your questions. This, as you can see from this title, there's a lot of youth in it. So this is what we're studying in this particular project. We're studying youth, who we conceptualize as the target audience of EU public diplomacy, and interactions between youth opinions coming from Ukraine about the European Union, and specifically 3 Baltic states as the representatives of the European Union. And in a mirror reflection, we want to see how youth in 3 Baltic states see the Ukrainian developments and Ukraine's choice to go towards Europe. We are looking at 3 ages of youth. We're looking at school children, and it's not a very typical input into EU foreign policy discussions. We're looking at students, those who are graduating or masters. So they are just to enter the workforce according to their speciality. They might be already working, but might not necessarily be the speciality. And the third group, it's the young professionals, so early career, school, university, early career. These are people who are making policies, who will be making policies in the future. School children are future voters. The world belongs to youth. Where does youth stand when they look at each other in these four countries? So we started our project, which is supported, as you can see, by Erasmus Plus of the European Commission. It's a Jean Monnet project, it's a 2-year project. We started with the premise that if we look empirically with lots of nuances at how youth looks at each other, it could help us to discover 2 opportunities for the EU public diplomacy. Opportunity number 1. In the recent years, lots of polls in Ukraine indicated a mild deterioration of the EU image in Ukraine. This is not lastly due to the fact that the conflict is going on, that the EU sanctions didn't bring Crimea back to Ukraine, and people are still dying in the east. So this is obviously a problem. But we did observe in many of the polls, irrespective of the year, irrespective of the company who took this, so many companies who are now observing what Ukraine thinks about Europe, there is one cohort which remains unwaveringly positive about Ukraine's European choice, about gains for Ukraine and for themselves with Ukraine's European choice, and this is Ukrainian youth. And we were very intrigued by this finding, and we thought, wait a second, there's something interesting, there's something new here. Let's look at these, at the youth, and specifically at the youth born after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Here we're thinking about the second opportunity. And the opportunity is coming obviously with the fact that in our previous research, the Jean Monnet network, which lasted for 3 years, we found out that Ukraine's imagination of the Baltic is incredibly positive. The Baltic states are the champions of Ukraine and the European Union integration story. The Baltic states are kind of protectors and defenders and take Ukraine's side in the conflict with Russia. But what about those who are born after the collapse of the Soviet Union? We stereotypically may think they are in the same boat, but these are people who are born into completely different political realities. They don't speak the same language, they don't read the same books, they don't watch the same movies. It's not the shared discourse anymore, or maybe it used to be during the Soviet Union. Are we fair to think that youth who are born after 1991 stands on exactly the same premises? Or should we be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more critical, and a little bit more empirically thorough? So these are the 2 opportunities that set up our project to go, and we hope as scholars we propose something innovative in terms of theories and methods. So a little bit of that will come your way very, very soon. But I would like to say that this all is impossible without incredible multicultural and multidisciplinary team. We have Team Baltic led by Vilnius Institute of Political Analysis and colleagues from VMU. You see the logos on the board. We have Estonia represented by Taltech, the law department. We have Latvia represented by Latvian Institute of International Affairs. We have a premier Ukrainian university, Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev. Our colleagues are sitting over there. We have University of London, Royal Holloway. We have Queen's Mary, Belfast, Northern Ireland on board. And for some reason it is led from New Zealand. Yes, New Zealand, Christchurch National Centre for Research in Europe, University of Canterbury. So this is a very brief introduction where we are starting. What's going to happen today? I'm going to give a floor to my colleagues as well as to myself. And then after each input, we will stop and we'll invite questions and discussions. And then we'll move on to the next one. We will start with presentation from Lithuania. We are in Lithuania. So that's the cake on the table. I've been told this is the cake to try. It smells delicious. And so don't feel shy, do something to it. I've been told you can eat it by hand, but yeah, there are napkins over there. Then after Baltic looking at Ukraine, I will present a mirror reflection, Ukraine looking at Baltic. Then Jana and Pauline will talk about the comparison of narratives, and we'll finish with Ben and Alistair talking about what does it mean for youth opinion, and we'll present some first results. This is our first year. More to come in Baltic next year, maybe even more. But this is literally the midpoint of our project. So we're looking forward to your feedback, your questions, because it helps us enormously in our last year of the project. Thank you for your attention, and I'm giving the floor to Gintaras because he is from Lithuania. Vilnius Institute of Political Affairs.
Hello everyone, my name is Gintaras Šumskas. I represent the Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, also Tautas Magnus University. And I did a lot of footwork for this project, a lot of research. So as being frontier, on the frontier of research in Lithuania for this project, not for every project, I will give you just some fresh insights on what happened on media, first media output analysis. And we also have some data, some small comparative set of data. We will compare the data from the last year's July. It's a representative survey on its opinion poll on the public evaluations on Ukraine policies, on Lithuania's place in public diplomacy, should or should not Lithuania support Ukraine, the perceptions of the Ukraine, and so on and so on. And we repeated some questions, a few questions from this survey, which we are a particular interest of us. Just surveying a small group of young people, mainly from, it's how it comes from high schools, so they are all 18 years plus, and the second part come from, it's a student audience, so they are a little bit elder. And for now, our decision is to use, we're not decided yet what actually the youth is. We have many definitions from many different institutions. So for now, like the temporary decision is keep in mind that the youth is someone who is less than 30 years old. Probably we'll find some other definition and include and make the survey more inclusive, but for now this is it. So, what they call it's a small discussion on media reflections and survey public opinion, just to see what's happening. And yes, we are starting from the people's voice from the survey. Some data, you can find it on the table. Some data comes from last year's survey, but the survey, yes, it concerned all population, all Lithuanian population. In this case, I just separated the youth cohort, the youth audience. So the sample, of course, is a bit smaller. It's the audience, the people who are younger than 30 years old, so the sample is 212. Yeah, it's still to group some inferences, and we just check if the youth opinion is different and if it's changing from the last year's opinion. So first thing is, it comes from this year's public opinion, not public opinion, from youth opinion survey. The sample was 60. It's mainly young, very young people, and we asked a very open question about associations, how young people perceive Ukraine. Just the first 3 impressions, and yes, the picture was. As you saw, it's pretty apocalyptic or gloomy. I don't know who makes that image, but we just calculated. These are open-end questions, so I just grouped them into big groups, so we can see that the biggest part, it's almost 46%, almost half of the surveyed population mentioned something connected with the war, conflict, death, ruin, the invasion, occupation of the Crimea, and so on and so on. So I think it's quite a good reflection, actually, what's happening, how the Ukraine is depicted. Of course, in many cases, it's visible as victim of the war, victim of aggression, and I don't know. Yeah, we may say that it's pretty sad view toward the Ukraine, but we can see, let's say, some positive things in that. I think it's good that young people recognize that there is a big problem that we should take into account that the world around us is not always very nice, peaceful and beautiful, but something is going on just in a quite distant neighborhood. So the perceptions are like this. Of course, we may add also the Crimean crisis, so it would be even more. And we can also add Russia to that cocktail. So basically what it is, it's like a perception of the Ukraine in a nutshell, how the young people see it. And yes, we may claim that, of course, the media has a big impact upon the formation of that opinion. Yes?
Were multiple answers allowed, or just one answer?
Yeah, we asked three answers, so we just grouped. So basically, this war, conflict, and anything was literally almost everyone mentioned something connected to the conflict, speaking about three impressions. So some people started, let's say, with watermelons, Black Sea, and war. Some people said war, death, cruelties. But yeah, it's just cumulative.
Everybody should name three things.
Yes. What comes, of course, not necessary. Some people just name one, let's say war or Black Sea, but we just calculated the cumulative answers.
So it's only 71 answers in the biggest group.
These 71 answers, it's other, which means that people just mentioned some, I don't know, Eurovision stars. It's just one or two answers. That's why we just.
So, but that's not a really big group, isn't it?
Yeah, we call it. It's a pilot project, and it's of course it's not representative, but it's huge impressions.
Yeah.
But I think when you see the numbers, it's quite impressive because actually, literally every second mentioned something connected to the war and conflict. And of course, we may see what would happen in the representative survey, but I think that it's pretty good indication, even having in mind,
That's plausible.
yeah, it's almost half the population I mentioned, and I think something like that. Well, let's see now the opinion on how our countries actually, how Lithuania could support in which parts, in which spheres Lithuania could cooperate with Ukraine. Yeah, if you're checking that report, this report is based on a representative survey, and in this case we just separated youth opinions. But yeah, differences are not so big, they are quite reflected into the popular opinion poll. So what basic things what we saw, and I think it was quite good reflected in other countries' surveys, Latvia, Estonia. We can see some kind of pragmatic side, I would say. What I'm saying by that, that young, let's say Lithuanians, young respondents of Lithuania are more tend to support Ukraine in some, let's say, soft power things. For example, support civil society, expand economic cooperation, promote cooperation, scientific, cultural sector, and so on and so on. But if we come to the questions concerning, say, really those parts, let's say, hardcore parts where the involvement is really like strong and visible, like military or financial aid. So in this case, the respondents are more cautious. They are more thinking that, okay, probably yes, but let's say these two spheres are, we are the citizens, but the people are not so willing, not so tend to support these spheres. And actually, this pretty well reflects the public opinion poll, what you can see as in these reports. So let's see if there is any difference this year, because we repeated these questions, just added some new in 2019. And actually, yeah, we see that the basic opinions, the basic tendencies are pretty the same. The absolute majority more tend to support like software, soft power and involvement. Military aid and of course financial aid is not, let's say, very popular. Again, it's a pilot-sized sample, but still we see that the tendencies are pretty the same. They are reflected in the representative sample, they are reflected in the same samples, just a cut of youth, and they are presented in this year's survey. So these are like the general tendencies of the cooperation, and yes, the main message from that is that the use probably seems like more, we can see that slow and probably basic, sometimes pragmatism, just thinking about some soft power involvements, not say giving away huge resources as involving in military, probably military assistance and financial aid. Of course, we didn't mean the direct military involvement. It's basically support, let's say, by, I don't know, supplying some ammunition or and so on. So these are the same. Just to check the comparisons, we see that the tendencies are pretty the same. Of course, we cannot claim that there is some big change, or if any. So let's move to the media analysis. Service is pretty usual, which is, let's say, initial part of the most interesting things, which will be presented by our colleagues. It's youth sorting and youth opinions. They have comparative data. But let's see how it started. Yeah, we decided we picked, I would say, one of the three major internet outlets. Yeah, as you can see, for example, LLT is still missing, but at this time, actually this channel went through big changes and it was not such visible as it is today. For example, today, of course, we would definitely also include LRT. So what we did, it was 1 month observation, just calculating articles, news articles, and analyzing them. Those articles were those in which Ukraine as a keyword appears, different spheres. It was necessary just to see, to extract the narrative and to see what actually is happening in the media. So the numbers, visibility. First thing, what is very visible, and this quite surprising, we were quite used that Delphi was like the first number one, which biggest producer of news on the Ukraine. It was actually pretty unexpected because we had comparative data from 2018, where of course Delphi was undisputed leader. But in this case, we see that it's 15 minutes, 15 minuter LT, actually even beat Delphi in this sphere, which is quite interesting. Another observation, of course, I think it's very important that the overall volume on articles of the Ukraine is lesser, and actually substantially lesser if we compare it to Estonia, especially, and Latvia. We, by default, we just thought that, okay, Lithuania is like number one. This, of course, is our perception, but actually it's not, now it's not a fact. You can see that it's, the truth is a bit different. We live in the alternative truth. So, and the other thing is that if we compare the volume, which actually appeared in 2018, the volume, again, decreased quite dramatically. It means that Lithuanian media just pays less and less attention. It's probably some kind of saturation of the news that everyone is having. Of course, media being, of course, business actors, they're probably calculating that some more topics are getting more attention than Ukraine. Yeah, the other, I would say, symptom which separates, let's say, media 2019 and media 2018, that this year, in the current year, even the design presenting the Ukraine changed. For example, in 2018, 2017, these major outlets used to have, at least Delphi and 15 minutes LT, used to have like a separate menu column, which is Ukraine. It was like sports, culture, world, Ukraine. Now Ukraine is under the section of world, so it means that of course they receive less and less clicks. So it's quite a symptomatic thing to see. Now let's speaking about the degree of centrality. Who is the central actor when we found the Ukraine in the text? Yes, we can see that if Ukraine is mentioned, it means that it's actually the article on Ukraine. In the absolute majority of cases, what we mean by majority, secondary and minor, it means that, for example, in some cases, the Ukraine could be mentioned only in the context, and the article would be about, I don't know, Russia, Lithuania, anything. But we see that in many cases, in majority of cases, if outlets write about the Ukraine, it's mainly about Ukraine, and everyone else is a secondary actor. So it means that they're focusing a lot on them. Now thinking about the distribution by thematic, main thematic frames, of course it's quite a quantitative thing. It's a lot of things lying beyond these definitions. We see that it's, and it's, I would say again, quite interesting in comparison with Baltic states, where the normative domain, which means telling, speaking about, let's say, how the country should behave, for example, speaking about the human rights, about good governance, and so on and so on, they actually appear in the almost 1/3 of the articles. Of course, it's an assumption, but we can see that, for example, at least journalists, experts commenting Ukraine, they, in many cases, they tend to mention, for example, human rights issues, good governance issues, corruption issues, peace, resolution issues, and so on and so on. It's quite interesting. Again, what's it's a sad story that at least comparing with Latvia, we almost have none articles connected with culture. It's somewhere 2% or anything. And 0 articles connected with research and technologies and development, RST sector. It's absent, but I think it's in many cases it just echoes with Latvia and Estonia. So mainly we are teaching how to live, and we are reporting on diplomacy, domestic politics, international relations. Domestic politics is big just because this media analysis took part during the presidential campaign in the Ukraine. That's why in many cases it was classified as domestic for the Ukraine. Okay, speaking about the normative frame, as I told, out of this 30%, we see that in the majority of cases, journalists discuss good governance. And of course, corruption falls under that. Reforms in public administration falls under that section, and so on and so on. And of course, it's democracy, freedom, and liberty. It's quite a good piece of information which comes from that. Now let's see about the emotions, and I think it was Natalia stated it very clearly in the presentation that there is no surprises. We just love Ukraine and we just hate Russia in this case. We can see. I don't need to comment the numbers, but if you just check the articles, it's pretty clear. You can literally find very few articles which are actually we are sometimes more angry at Latvia than angry at Lithuania. It's a joke. It's not representative. It's about Ukraine. Now we are angry at Latvia. I don't know why. Okay, let's move on. So it's pretty clear. Now, yes, just finalizing the thoughts. It's we'll also check and try to depict the illustrations and the general story about the illustrations. That being a media outlet, at least in Lithuania, at least 100%, except one, I guess, article had some visual support, visual illustration, which it's quite interesting to see. But the sad story is that in many cases we have a lot of generic illustrations. By saying generic, it means that, for example, it's something about the presidency. So we could see, let's say, the same pictures of Poroshenko taken from the same angle, and in many cases, in some cases we may spot, like special emotions, which actually is illustrate the article, but it doesn't happen very often. And in some cases, I will illustrate that funny case, for example, depicting Zelensky, today's acting president. During the whole month, they actually used 1 or 2 pictures, and one picture just repeating from outlet to outlet, from article to article. It just means that it's journalists actually didn't try too much to put some additional emotional aspect into article. So, speaking about some, let's say, negative articles and articles which were classified as negative, it's about the story about killing, how the one governor of one region was involved in actually cruelty killing one activist. And so yes, you can see some very clear emotions. The article supported the very strong emotions in this case. Neutral, again, I see we discussed with Estonia, it's in many cases it's copy-paste picture, it's some kind of a love story, almost Hollywood story, but again, I think it's more than exception when we can see the clearly emotional thing. And yes, the famous picture on Zelensky, it was repeated and repeated and repeated, like in all the month. If you read Zelensky in every article, it was the super picture, and it just reflects me one favorite movie. It's I don't know if they picked that symbolic, but it's pretty visible in the Lithuanian media. Well, just almost finalizing, these are the comments, because we also analyzed some comments, first comments which appearing after the articles. These are comments in the nutshell. Of course, Ukraine is removed from that for the bigger visibility. And these are top 20 keywords which actually appear when people speak, perceive, and understand Ukraine. Again, you can see a lot of information that is speaking about problematic things, and yes, energy, it's war, Crimean situation, of course, people see business, people see corruption, immigrants, and so on and so on. But yes, Lithuania, of course, it's present because it comes from Lithuanian news outlet. So again, we can speak about this plus people's voice, and yes, we have plans to do a separate analysis, I believe, on the comments from every country, because I think it's even more interesting than analyzing official data. So the finalizing things, it's about, again, I think it's sometimes, at least for Lithuania case, it's a bit disturbing. Speaking about the sources of information, we see in some kind almost monopolic situation. Just an illustration, we can see that almost every article, majority of articles are supported by some local news agency, local journalists, and so on. And if we look who is that local, so we can see that BNS, it's actually rules of the information flows. It's not half, but it's nearly half information market as produced by Baltic news service. Well, international sources, as you can see, it's only 1 month observation, but still, you see that they're using just a wide variety of international sources. You cannot see, we cannot track any tendencies in there. They're just sporadic. But speaking about Lithuanian sources, so you can see, so in many cases it's either local journalist, local outlet, or in other cases it's BNS. Again, I think sometimes it explains why, and sometimes when you analyze different outlets, of course you get quite a similar information, quite a similar, I would say, dry information with no comments. So thank you, and I think maybe Sharunas wants to add some insights or comments.
mean, I have like a comment on the question probably about this monopolization of thought about foreign policy generally. We clearly see that apart from the fact that the Lithuanian news outlets don't have journalists abroad, more or less they don't. I mean, they use sporadic sources, what you see here, like, okay, the parts of Bloomberg, Finance, UA, etc., etc. So there is no original content. I mean, there is like very generic rewriting of general topics, and from the media point of view, I don't see any serious investment into the topic. Or they consume the topics which are brought by someone.
I think to this point it would be very, I think, extremely interesting observation from the Ukraine. Does anyone wants to illustrate who is among, let's say, top sources on Baltic Street? So it's Delphi. Delphi is one of the major international sources for Ukrainian outlets who speak about Baltic State. Am I right? Yes.
Followed by ER, which is
Yeah, Estonian or Delphi. Of course, Delphi. So it's very interesting when you think that as if you perceive, of course, Delphi. What? Yeah.
No, I just want to comment what Shirin was asking. Yes, it's what we observed also on other Baltic states. It's the quality of the journalist work, because majority of the articles are just reproductions from somewhere without any local flex. Very short probably and very descriptive, superficial. And but in cases, for example, in our case, one of the medias which we observed was LSM.LE. It's the consortium of Latvian public television and public radio. In some cases, they had special journalists, special reporters sent to Ukraine, for example, for the remembrance events of Maidan. And then when you have the journalists there, you have at least 5 qualitative articles. And it's a completely different information. It's very personal, related to the people who participated in Maidan. It has some comparisons with Latvia, when we find it for its independence. And you see a completely different part. But if on the everyday level, they just reproduce something, which is, I don't know, maybe probably not even read by anyone.
So it's more than an exception. Yes, yes. These outlets, for example, yes, with 15 minutes, they do send their correspondence, and of course they make huge personal stories, but it's more than an exception. Of course, they do not have journalists on field. So, if you have any additional questions or comments before we move, yeah.
But let's say BNS writes an article, and BNS is certainly a client of Reuters, so maybe the original source comes from Reuters, and then it's pretty
You never know, because actually they're quoting just BNS. We don't know what happens next. Probably yes.
It's another common what we observed everywhere in Baltic states, that they just don't refer to original sources. In many cases, they reproduce the article. I know that I've read something like this in Politico, but there's no reference.
Yes.
Well, my question is about the political acts, which means that if they have in Lithuania publications also only that are like written by Reuters or Interfax, does this mean that there is no less public diplomacy, because that those politicians who do foreign affairs or policies, they do not invest into spreading knowledge on Ukraine? Well, there can be policies, there can be no policies. So this means for me that there is no support of the news on certain political topics or foreign affairs that Lithuania is interested.
Yeah, probably yes, and I think it also echoes another issue, which is let's say very sound in Lithuania now. It's a historical memory. Again, we see that yes, the society, the media, the politicians are just do not know what to do. When it happens some very salient events.
And again, Latvia is a very clear example of what you are saying, because in Latvia kind of we
and it's also from the Estonian point of view. Sorry, just a few 5 cents from my side. It's interesting. There is a completely different picture in terms of the. It's about the habit of media. You know what they are writing and have been writing for years. In Estonia, the absolute overwhelming majority of the articles are produced with a local hook in the article. It's almost 2/3. And in the image, there is like out of 154 locally produced articles, in 104 in the image there is a local hook. So what it means that Estonian media in general, they write articles with a focus on Estonia, and if Ukraine comes in, that's okay, good on you for Ukraine. If Ukraine, they are missing out. So the idea is, hey, people, we are writing for you to tell a story on Estonia, but there is a link to Ukraine, fantastic. There is no link to Ukraine, it will be Zimbabwe or Djibouti. So I'm making this up, but or exaggerating. But the point is that this is diametrically different from what we picked up in Lithuania for some reason, because yeah, and it's interesting. It's one of the points of difference. And
It's very interesting because, for example, in Lithuania there is this state fund for the support of media. Yes, there is such a fund which has no support line, for example, for the information on Ukraine. That's why the media goes the cheapest way. So they subscribe to BNS, and BNS has a condition that you cannot change a word in their message. You can change only the title of the article. So you have subscription if you are media in one of those. Have subscription, you just take as it is, and this is it. So also maybe the same applies to the international information agencies. So maybe this shows that the media itself is in a deep crisis.
Or they lost.
Cheapest way.
Or they lost the focus, so they or even never had the focus on this nation. They just kind of tell the stories about everything they can pick up, but not on Lithuania specifically.
Or maybe they just doing the cheapest business, just republishing
Possibly,
what's
yeah.
regurgitating.
Yeah, another question. Was the Zelensky serials available on Lithuanian TV or internet?
Yeah, of course, internet helps everything, but I don't think that Lithuanian TV stations had shows with the Zelensky. At least major channels, no. Yeah, but
afterwards,
but not main TV channels. Probably some Russian, Ukrainian, but not main outlets. Not at least not Lithuanian.
And you can watch it on YouTube.
Yes, it's.
Yes, but I mean, the image is very dependent on,
Yeah.
That's why he won the elections, so maybe that would have helped to create more sympathy even than it has been found out till now.
Yeah, yes, it was not present on Lithuanian TV at least.
LNK showed.
LNK.
LNK?
Oh, I missed it.
In subtitles, or is it with Lithuanian subtitles or Russian?
Okay, I will move now to the mirror reflection, and now let's see what media in Ukraine says about the 3 Baltic states, but also about the European Union. In this particular presentation, Viktor Krivchenko from Cherkasy National University, as well as the National Center for Research in Europe, who potentially could also step in and answer the question. But before I start talking about Ukraine, I actually want to quote European Union Global Strategy. If you know, European Global Strategy projects the main narrative of EU foreign policy, how the European Union should deal with locations far away from Europe as well in its neighborhood. And so there are 3 big messages messages coming from EU global strategy, right? This is principle pragmatism, global governance, and resilience. And specifically for EU foreign policy towards neighborhood, the main message is on resilient neighborhood. What does it mean? Resilience is a big word, very popular word. What does it mean? Fragility beyond, this I'm quoting EU global strategy. Fragility beyond our borders threatens all our vital interests. By contrast, resilience, the ability of states and societies to reform, thus withstanding and recovering from internal and external crises, benefits us and countries in our surrounding regions, sowing the seeds for sustainable growth and vibrant societies. Together with its partners, the EU will therefore promote resilience in its surrounding regions. Together with my colleague Ulla Elkström from Lund University, we analyzed the metaphorical images of how the European Union depicts itself and what message it projects to the rest of the world and to the neighborhood. And our analysis pointed to certain roles. This is what the European Union thinks about itself in relation to the neighborhood. It's a facilitator of processes in the neighborhood. It's a nurturer of the neighborhood. You've just seen the images of sowing the seeds. It's a capable person, so it sees itself compares to a human being who's a capable person, attractive and committed partner, a constructor, engineer, and architect in Eastern region vis-a-vis Russia. If anybody's interested in that particular article and how we came to these conclusions, I'm happy to give you more detail. Which kind of outlines our big questions. And our big questions for this particular case. So how then the Ukraine sees itself? What is the self-conception of Ukraine? The second one, what images and roles does Ukraine prescribe to the European Union and in this context to 3 Baltic states? Then we want to hear how do images of the Baltic states compare to images of the European Union? From our previous findings, we suspect that potentially the Baltic states could enjoy a more positive imagery than images of the European Union. What about Russia? How do the EU, 3 Baltic states compare to images of Russia? How do they compare to the EU self-conceptions, the facilitator, the capable partner, and finally, so what and who cares? How does this information help us to do something with the policy? Because images, you cannot touch them. Perceptions, you cannot sniff them, right? They exist in our heads, but they have a diagnostic propensity because we have a choice. They influence how we diagnose the situation in international relations. They tell us how to act. So there is more to images than just a benign cognitive exercise. I'm a scholar. I have to tell you in what way we're going to discuss this particular moment called images, perceptions, and narratives. The first level of reflection today will come from international relations theory about images. This theory tells us if we're thinking about international relations images, you need to think about 3 stories. A story of power. Is it a strong actor or a weak actor? What is the perception, strong or weak? It's a story of interests. Does this actor perceived to bring me benefit or threats? And the story of affinity. Do I see this actor as superior or inferior towards me? Level 1. Then, from roles theory, we want to see how then Ukraine conceives itself. What does it see? What are my roles? And then we want to see how Ukraine sees roles of other actors. The European Union, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Russia. And we're doing it in this particular presentation today through an interesting tool and using metaphorical descriptions. I just showed you how metaphors describe certain roles of the European Union, and that's what we want to see. Through using a colorful language of metaphors, we want to see, first of all, what was compared to what and with what emotion. So, I'm giving you an example, not from Baltic media, but from The Economist. Ukraine's economy is a plane that never took off. So it's a comparison of a very complex abstract concept of economy to a plane that doesn't take off. There's nothing in the saying that says this is bad. Everything's neutral. But from our experience, we know not taking off is bad for a plane. So we're already attaching certain evaluation, and underlying it all is an image of not moving forward and upwards. We're coming from a particular culture where not moving forward and upwards is bad. So there's not only about the plane, which is one story, there is a deeper conceptual vision of an actor who's not moving forward. Complex tool, but a very interesting tool because it allows to look at roles in very great nuance. So what we analyze. In our case, we're looking at Ukrainian media. We observe these three sources, which are incredibly popular. You see the numbers on the screen. Ukrainska, Европейska Pravda, Новое Время, and Сегодня. The keywords mirror study, right? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Baltic states, and then Russia and the European Union, if they only appeared in the article that references a Baltic state, the same period of observation. Very simple slide, volume. We can see how volume is 155 articles, about 3 states in 1 month, and we can see how Lithuania leads most of the stories, which reference comes with Lithuania, then Latvia, and then Estonia. And look how the European Union, the stories about the European Union in this particular period are really not that numerous. When they appear in Ukrainian media, what themes then are presented there? What we can see, it's too much information, right? Let's look at the colors, green, green, green. It stands for military and security. So the first thematic input by Ukrainian e-news portals read by millions of people, it's about military and security. The slide blue, about domestic affairs. Something is happening in your countries. Ukrainians want to know about these things. And then dark blue is international diplomatic relations. So your country is doing something with the world. Finally, purple is about norms and values. I come to norms and values. But overall, a very coherent picture. So even though the volume could be different, the profile pretty much resonating between the three actors. We're talking about frames. It's just what is represented. What about the evaluations? Another interesting story. Lithuania is probably the most positive, closely followed by Latvia and Estonia. So all this in the same, right? The same. They're very positive. Almost no negativity here. With Latvia, a little bit more negativity, but Lithuania, come on, look, that's the least state. You can see the European Union interesting, right? Out of the 4 European actors, the European Union actually gets the least positive, but a lot of neutrality. A little bit of neither. Russia, nothing positive. And Ukraine itself sees a rather positive light. So, what about those metaphors? What about those colorful images? Just to remind you, this is the volume, but there is no direct correlation with the number of metaphorical descriptions. Despite the fact that Russia and the European Union was the least reported, they get the most of the metaphors. The metaphor carries 2 functions. First, it educates. It gives you information about a complex actor in very simple terms. Economy didn't take off. Easy. The second, and we think one of the reasons why the European Union is such a complex actor, it needs to be understood in simple terms. Here, it's about inducing a certain evaluation and emotion. Metaphor gives you an immediate access to feelings, and that's why they're so numerous and frequent in all sorts of media discourses. So you can see how Lithuania gets not a lot of, and then Estonia and Latvia are literally invisible in metaphorical terms, which is an interesting finding. So, finding number 1. We all think, I told you stereotypically, the Baltic states, they're seen as the friends of Ukraine, champions and advocates. What we find here when we apply this very complex and nuanced tool of the metaphor, that there is a continuum of states, of friends. On the side of allies, we have the most of the friends is Lithuania, who is given through the metaphors the roles of an ally, but more than just an ally who's just on your side, right? But neutral. A protector, a friend, who is ready to fight for you. So the scenario gives you a story that Lithuania is ready to go for Ukraine to fight for Ukraine's cause. Very close to the European Union, who is also seen obviously as an ally, but also as a protector. And remember, EU global strategy as an architect and constructor in the region. And it's interesting, it's also compared to a destination. So Ukraine's narrative of a hero, a protagonist going on the path to Europe, and Europe is the big goal. Then we have Estonia, who is seen as a strong ally, but principled, but not too many of these, remember, not too many metaphors. And finally, the weakest on the continuum of friends in metaphorical terms, and what media tells us, is Latvia, who is always trying to look what the others are saying first, and not taking a first word or action. And of course, on the end of adversaries, Russia, there are no positive metaphors, no positivity. It's compared to an aggressor, a person who is an aggressor, and a person who is a lawbreaker. So remember power, dimension of power. We can see that there is a little bit of a continuum. With Lithuania and the EU framed as if we're stronger, while Estonia in the middle and Latvia is a weaker one. A stronger ally gives you an opportunity. A weaker ally gives you less opportunity. So this is the story of benefits and opportunities. A strong adversary is a threat. So we definitely see a dichotomy here, but what was fascinating is to see that the metaphors reveal the nuances and stories of roles. What about that inferior, superior? Metaphors didn't tell us much. Here we're looking at the representations of norms and values attached to these actors. Democracy, freedom, rule of law, good governance, solidarity, gender equality. In Ukrainian media, representations of the three Baltic actors are heavily normative. They come always with a normative taste. It's always about something. What was it about? What? Again, too much numbers. Look at the colors. Blue, blue, blue. Rule of law. It's either Ukraine is underperforming in the rule of law and the Baltics show the example or tell what we have to change, or they are themselves are already doing so well, so no reference to Ukraine, they are rule of law. It's about corruption. So rule of law then becomes nothing about peace is visible. It's about obvious situation, but it's about Ukraine's need to reform. And it's literally telling us, if you wish, a story of Ukraine yourself. Even though in these reports Ukraine was reporting about the European Union and the three Baltic states, really it was talking about itself. We do not see things how they are, we see things how we are. In this story, we still see that Ukraine conceptualizes itself as a hero walking to Europe, with lots of challenges. A colleague of ours, Elena Morozova, analyzed 8 newspapers, and she found this narrative of hero fighting through the obstacles, but being kind of trying to fight. And that's what we expected. We expected that the image will be the hero who's there are obstacles, but the hero is able to fight. What we found out, that the metaphors revealed a different self-reflection. A weak, injured, and in a constant need of protection, if you wish, a victim. And this is something which was discussed by some of our policymakers obviously in Ukraine, that the image of victim is not helping Ukraine internationally, that it needs to snap out of it. Nicholas Kahl, a big authority in public diplomacy, in 2019 published a book in which he asked a big question: why did the world didn't react to Crimea how it probably should have reacted? And one of his conclusions that Ukraine failed to produce an attractive, appealing, modern image of post-Soviet Ukraine. The Baltic states succeeded, and Ukraine did not. And with this, it is very important to keep it in mind that Ukraine seems through these publications is not only about international, it's also about internal image. It's the image they send to its own citizens. And so internal images, good internal images are very important. Citizens feel better about themselves, they're more confident, they have a sense of direction and purpose. But coming back to the Baltics, what was really amazing is that positivity which comes in media. There's lots of research about emotions in international relations. It's all about negativity, because negativity lives in a different part of our brain. We react to negative messages quicker because we need to survive. It's a threat for us. Positivity lives in the other part of our brain. So if you're a cognitive scientist, you know this. Thus, media keep selling negativity and scandal and drama because it scars us more. In this case, we see consistent positivity. And this is something very unusual. Not very often you see actors who are consistently presented in a good light, which we argue it's fantastic for the Baltic states and diplomatic potential in Ukraine. It's investment in tourism, more clients, and more products, and more services, and political advantages. So, remember I talked about principal pragmatism, how your foreign policy needs to be pragmatic. So potentially positive images of three Baltic states which keep being reproduced in the media of Ukraine with huge outreach is indeed a gateway to a more pragmatic, more effective, and cost-efficient EU public diplomacy. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Good. Yes.
Hello, Victoria from British Institute. I was interested about the selection of media sources. Are those media sources you selected also popular in the parts of southern and eastern Ukraine?
Yeah, they've done national. Victor, who did media analysis in detail, could tell you more about Victor if you want to. But yes, these are nationally circulated and nationally clicked on sources, southern Ukraine, east.
And why did you select those sources?
Based on the numbers of the traffic, if you wish. So there's a top axis.
So these are the top 3 most popular in Ukraine?
Yeah.
But are they the 3 most popular in the southern Ukraine as well, or are they different?
It's a example, there is assessment of them according to their transparency and following of freedom of media that shows that the chosen ones are still on the top list. They're not the same order, but they're still there. So they're very well restricted, and they have editions in Ukrainian, in Russian, and sometimes in English. So they do serve, and actually what is interesting, that the Ukrainian article is actually translated into Russian, so these are correlations, which was not the case in Delphi. Delphi in Estonia serving Russian-speaking population produces absolutely different content to Delphi serving speaking Estonian-speaking population.
And isn't it surprising that in the eastern Ukraine there's no positive article about Russia because Russia protected the separation?
That's not only Eastern Ukraine. So these three popular news platforms in 1 month of observation did not produce a single positive image of Russia.
Those three, but the other ones, because there was,
Yeah. Well, of course we have to limit, because you cannot. If we looked at the most circulated ones, with the whole why we're doing it, because we want to establish the shared discourses. What is on the bigger level? Which stories are circulated, and then we want to ask young people, do they buy these stories? Maybe they don't. I'm giving up some. But that's the whole point. You need to know some point of shared discourses. And we already know from the survey of the youth in our project that online media, news platform, is number one for them to get information about the world. And of course, there will be some other regional specific, these are national.
What's the difference between the popularity of those outlets? For example, in the west of Ukraine and the east, like how dramatically does it differ? Because I imagine kind of drastical
Victor, since you were looking into the statistics, could you tell us more?
Unfortunately, there's no such statistics. These are the all Ukrainian newspapers.
Ukrainian
All
language.
Ukrainian, Russian.
Yeah, there are no regional like surveys or something.
I'm sorry, I encourage everyone to speak a bit louder because we have recording. And some of you, of course, tend to speak department table tongue, so a bit louder.
Okay,
No
thank you.
matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that those questions about the east or west of Ukraine and how they're popular is very, very interesting. Because in Lithuania we are tracing the change or the difference of images of Ukraine depending on which in which information bubble the respondents are. Where from do they get the information? In Lithuania we have a huge, we have a population minorities, for example, that are in Russian information outlets influence. And therefore their images of Ukraine are different. On Ukraine.
So if you know a bit of the history of these portals, you know that Ukrainska Pravda, Европейska Pravda, these are the ones established by Gangadze, who was decapitated. And so it's always been a voice, if you wish, of liberal, pro-European Ukraine. And it's an insane amount of clicks national per week. Сегодня, obviously, potentially is appealing more to Russian speakers. And if you talk about Новое Время, which is an interesting outlet because it's rather analytical with incredible, it exists in Russian and English and Ukrainian, with very serious analysis of foreign policy, and it kind of positions itself on a pro-European but critical to the government position. So you can see we did touch a little bit different, but the main criteria for this project was the national circulation rather than regional. But in terms of youth opinion, we definitely see there are regional distinctions. But media is not the only source. We have to be very open about that. It's a power.
Can I just in this respect, for example, the Estonian story has more limitations in terms of from where to collect the data than the Ukrainian story, because in our postimes, in the Russian language postimes and in the Estonian language postimes, that these are two different postimeses, because sometimes the Estonian language article should be waiting for 4 days to get translated into the Russian language if there is a necessity. Sometimes they come up together, sometimes not. Sometimes it will never appear on the Russian side, which means that, but in our case, I mean, the idea behind was to drag narratives and then test those narratives against the opinion of the youth. So in Estonia, we collected 41 narratives out of the media, out of Postimees, Delfi, and ERR. And then together, we ended up, with the help of our nice researchers, they collected 41 narratives only. And then we kind of asked the youth, what do you think about this narrative? They said, oh, this is complete rubbish. Or, no, I love this. Or I don't understand this, so on. So the idea was not really to kind of say that, yeah, this media represents the narrative, but the idea is to ask the youngsters what they think about this, because if the problem was, and this is one of the inquiries, was that if the youngsters would feel uncomfortable that there is nothing in the list of those narratives they think it should be, that's a good find in itself, because maybe they were searching for something else, but the media is not producing this narrative, and this is one of the interesting questions.
Just to add, yes, the issue about the regional differences in Ukraine is very interesting, but actually we are doing it, and then the next stage of the research, our colleagues, Ukrainians, they have actually surveyed, they did a survey of opinions of young people in 4 different regional universities, like Odessa, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Kyiv, so they have very interesting findings there. So how do young people reflect on the narratives which are kind of produced national? But they are different.
And the national story is that it is a very positive image, which is, it confirms the initial assumption that the 3 Baltic states are seen as advocates and champions for Ukraine, and this is the message presented on the national stage. But just to come to the a huge amount of these news actually comes from Delphi and ER. So it's something also to look into, because who is actually the narrator, who actually tells the stories, and where do Ukrainian authors take the stories? And because of the financial limitations, they're eager to take news from the Baltic sources. And we're having a massive influence by Delphi on Ukrainian news about the Baltics.
Which is actually also not quality source.
It is what it is. Delphi is the main supplier of news for Ukrainian reporters.
In Ukrainian media, which include Baltic states, international sources prevail, and article international sources, Baltic sources prevail as well. So it's in a way it's like reproduction to a certain degree of the story that Baltic media tell about Baltic.
Because we're aware of time, we thought we will skip this next conversation and give the floor to Ben and Alistair, who will talk about the youth perception. So now we've heard 2 stories of narratives, two sets of images, and Ben and Alistair will finish the presentation with the findings about entertainment. But we will be happy to post these slides online, and if people would like to look at them, we will be happy to hear your feedback. Thank you, and we will find the next slide now. We will go up here. Lots of information.
Okay, thank you very much. Delighted to be back at VIPA. And we look forward to the discussion and enjoyed the discussion on the presentation so far. What Ben and I are going to do in a few short minutes is talk you through sort of our major contribution to this wider project. And that is to go and take the media analysis that has been done, has been introduced to you, and see how that resonates with young people in Ukraine and the Baltic states. and we're going to talk you through how we go about that, the research design that we use, and also Glenn's going to talk you through some initial high-level analysis of how young people view the messages that they're receiving. So we look forward to your comments. So what we take as a sort of an analytical focus are narratives or stories. We believe narratives are important because they perform a function which we'll outline. And a lot of analysis really focuses on what narratives are projected and how they're projected. And I think in an environment of fake news and pressure about information, the fact that perfect communication is impossible in politics, that studying how young people, for our study, is vital. So we try to get behind how they remix and process the messages that they're receiving. So analysing how that happens is quite difficult. The terrain, because it's very crowded, that discussion that you've been having about the different nuances of output, outlets, languages, penetration, all of those things make for a very complex information ecology. And we use, and teams in each of the 4 countries we're looking at have used what is known as a Q-sort methodology, which we borrow from social psychology to try to get behind what individuals think. So instead of thinking of groups of people, what Ukrainians think, we're actually going down to the individual level, and we're using mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative, to try to get behind how individuals view things. We take narrative, and this is sort of very briefly our understanding of narrative in politics. We believe narratives are used strategically, they are used to try to shape the behaviour of others, and they're very compelling and powerful in ways that I think we increasingly need to understand. They're sense-making or meaning-making devices that we employ, even in the way we talk to each other in this room and in this discussion. Ben and I sort of think about narratives in the following way. One, they're largely about our identities. So whether it's a personal narrative that we have, or in international relations we like to talk about states having identity narratives, whether they're neutral, whether they're great powers, whether they're rising powers. All of that requires an identity narrative explaining what we are. We also have narratives about the international system, stories that make us have sense of the complexity of the 21st century. We came out of, as we know very well, a bipolar system. That's a narrative, a story about 2 rival systems of economics and politics. And now we're moving into a more fluid space where competing narratives about where's next, what are we doing, how are we reforming, are prevalent. And finally, these 2 things then come together with policy narratives. From our identities and from our conceptions about the world, what policies do we pursue? If we think the world is based on sovereign states and that international communication is difficult, then we're going to pursue policies that support the state. If we're moving into a post-state, post-national environment, in many cases the European Union has this sort of identity, then we might push more collaborative schemes. As I said in my introduction there are really, as we see it, 3 main stages of communication of narratives that are intertwined. One, the formation of narratives, the process of deciding what we stand for in any of these 3 headline narratives. That could be political parties, governments coming up with what's next. I see it looks like the UK Parliament is going to be suspended to give Boris Johnson some time to form a narrative of post-Brexit Britain. Projection. Again, we've talked a little about projection in the discussion so far. Who are the newspapers? What are they sending? How are they communicating? And the new media ecology that we're seeing is increasingly difficult to get our heads around and complex to study. But the most difficult methodologically is how each of us in this room receives all of those many messages and makes sense of those in our own, often very personal way. And that's the unit that we're going for, reception. And this underpins this study and what we're working on. So to give you a sense of how the different components of this two-year project fit together. We first have done a broadsheet press analysis in each region, and that's been presented to you today. We have also talked to university and high school students in each of the countries, and that's what we're going to particularly focus on now. And then in the coming months, sometime around the end of the year, we're going to be talking to elites, young elites, in each of these countries. So what is Q-sort methodology? Not to get too techy and academic, but this in a very quick nutshell is what we're doing. So in order to do Q-sort, we need something to generate a study from, and that is referred to as a corpus. And we use the media analysis, everything that's being written about the Baltic states and Ukraine, to generate narrative statements, which we then put to the young people in each of the countries to ask them what they view. We then do quite a radical thing, which is make them choose in a forced distribution model, which we'll show you, what they agree with and what they disagree with. And this is quite challenging for anyone, because we essentially drive them to think about what is most compelling in any of the statements that they receive. From that, we're able to do two things. One, we're able to do a quantitative analysis, which allows us to find underlying patterns of understandings or meaning-making of international affairs, and then we'll talk you through that. And two, we also have a qualitative discussion with students about what underpins the logic of their selections. But what we're really interested in is how do citizens remix the narratives they hear in the media and from politicians? And this is really what our focus is. I see that there is a citizenship and youth project going on here in this building, and I think that really underpins the logic of the project. What are our young citizens thinking about international affairs, and what implications may that have going into the future? This is a sort of a version of what students are faced with in a forced distribution model, where we extract a number of narrative statements from the media analysis, normally somewhere between 30 and 40, and we ask them to physically, either with sticky paper and big A3 sheets, or on computer programs, to sort the statements along an agree or disagree line. In contrast to maybe what Tintaris was asking there, he poses questions in the survey and people are allowed to sort of individually come back. We are saying, no, you don't have that flexibility, you have to do it our way and tell us what you most agree with. And that's what researchers have to negotiate with groups of students in each of the areas. So we have, on the right, most agree statements, and on the left, most disagree. And this creates the analytical structure that Ben is going to talk through now.
Okay. Cheers, Alistair. So what this method is something that, if I'm in the Norwegian embassy and I need to find out, I get an intuitive sense when people come to my embassy about what they think about Norway, but if your foreign ministry is saying we need something more rigorous, we need some statistics, then this is something that is much more kind of, this is a kind of cheap and dirty way to get something that your government will be persuaded by because it's got quantitative and qualitative aspects. So we were doing this with these groups of students, and I would say as well, this method in social psychology needs quite small groups. This is not about a representative survey that spans the whole population. This is about mapping the range of narratives that exist within a group of people, in this case young people, in these areas. So this is who our researchers were talking to. So as Alistair said, they were presented with narratives and they were asked to kind of swap them around and put them on this chart and then explain why they agree with some, why they disagree with others, and then build their own narratives, basically. So those in Ukraine, through the national Ukrainian media that we analysed, they received these narratives that the Baltic states are an important partner, but that Ukraine needs help, and maybe NATO and Europe are going to help protect Ukraine, that Ukraine is becoming a decent country maybe. Some newspapers say, but others newspapers were saying, no, Ukraine is still weak, it's not resilient, and things like that. So basically, these were the things, these were the statements that or the narratives even, that the Ukrainian students were given. And what we found, when they were forced to rank these statements and forced to build their own narratives, first of all, that they strongly agreed with anything to do with freedom and autonomy for Ukraine. This was a very strong finding. And this was interesting because that meant that it might be that joining the EU might not be seen as a way of gaining freedom and autonomy, or joining NATO might not be. So particularly in Ivano-Frankivsk region, and to some degree in Odessa, there was a sense that, no, we need to build our own identity first before we then start thinking about who we're going to join. We need to kind of get our own house in order first. In terms of kind of hope for the future, the Kiev students, both in the university, National University and the high school, were the most optimistic in Ukraine. The university thinks that because Russia is threatening them or invading them, let's be honest, that the Baltic states are probably going to help at some point. There's still that expectation. Whereas the high school students were looking to the EU for help, which again, whether that's realistic or not, but this was their narratives about what's going on. As I say, there were the two regions that felt that Ukraine is isolated, but that led to a kind of pragmatic outlook. Both, all across the region, there was no sense, across all of the regions, there was no sense that, oh, right, Russia is definitely bad, and we all agree that. There was always gradations or mixtures, even in these regions. But there was this, we were discussing this yesterday, this kind of proverb, you hope for God's help, but you make your own chance. So in these regions, it was, we need to help ourselves first. So what that means for the Baltic states, maybe they don't want Lithuanians' help. Or maybe they want it in a very kind of, I don't know, on certain conditions or something like that. And we were wondering whether this idea of self-responsibility might be some way, in previous research we found in Ukraine that this kind of this victimhood discourse that we're always being occupied by somebody, and this becomes a problem because the rest of the world stops listening because it's quite negative. What Natalia was talking about having a positive image to get collaboration. And so maybe this could be the future narrative for Ukraine, maybe this kind of where we are going to just help ourselves and we'll come to you when we need you. Even in Kharkiv, there was massive division about whether Russia is a threat. So even where we think they would be most pro-Russian, there's still quite a lot of anti-Russian sentiments. And this shows maybe that opinions are shifting, that we shouldn't assume that people come from a certain cultural region, that they're going to have the views of their parents and grandparents, that there's generational things that we need to get into, and we need to be quite granular about this. And then there was also just this fact that some students just didn't know much about the Baltics. Why would they? They're not part of the same Soviet space anymore. So, in Estonia, what young people were hearing in the mainstream press was that the world is uncertain and we don't know where things are going. The EU is in crisis, Russia's a threat, America is unpredictable, we don't quite know what's going on with China. And so the question is how to respond to an uncertain world. So the line of vision was higher. It was like, we're looking at the world system and what we can do in it. Whereas in Ukraine, the horizon was, the perspective was, we're in a situation here. We don't care about China and things like that. So here there was a sense, yes, Estonian newspaper was saying, yes, Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression, Russia is dangerous for Estonia as well, so we should be helping Ukraine. That Ukraine is a partner in terms of business and cultural things like that. But we're only doing this because it's in our self-interest. We would only help Ukraine because it's in Estonia's national interest. But then there was the sense that, well, maybe we won't intervene that much because Ukraine is fragile and dangerous, and maybe it's a slow learner, it's bad people, it's corrupt. And so any engagement and partnership would be quite calculated and pragmatic. And then there was this beautifully interesting thing that our researcher Paulina picked up on, that in the Estonian data there was this, in the newspapers, there's this sense that history is about turning points. And after the Cold War, Estonia made the right choice, Ukraine has just made the wrong choice after wrong choice. And so Ukraine needs to start making the right choice, and they should look to us because we know how to make the right choice because we're Estonia. But there were other Estonian news that were saying, no, things are cyclical. If Ukraine's bad, it's always going to be bad. Things just never move on. So there was a divide of narratives being presented to the Estonian youth. So what do we find? We find that they buy this narrative. The young people bought the narrative in the terms used earlier about history being about big choices, which is really interesting because then that means in terms of your public diplomacy, you could frame things that in 2 years, Ukraine is going to have a big choice. Let's help them make the right choice. Let's get them in to understand situations in our way. So here we see that some proof that young people are kind of buying into what the newspaper is saying. And that leads to a kind of optimistic view of history because if right choices are possible, then we just have to help them make them. So if Ukraine can reform itself and get on the right path, then once you're on the right path, you will develop. Because Estonia got itself on the right path itself, and it's developed. That's how history works. Overwhelming positivity from the Estonian students. Action can make a difference. Russia can be contained. Ukraine can be helped. The only kind of negativity came through in terms of Ukrainian immigrants and workers coming to Estonia. But in terms of the international outlook, it was very, very positive. Latvia, again, high school and university students, the Latvian media was saying through this period that Ukraine is European and it needs to be moved back. It's been a victim of circumstance with Russia. It needs to go back to it needs to return to Europe, if you like. Obviously, Russia being a negative. Ukraine needs some kind of patron, it needs some kind of help. And the Baltic states generally might be able to provide some kind of help. But at the same time, Ukraine has been trying to reform itself and it's not been making progress. It's still a corrupt place. And given all of the uncertainty in the world, maybe Latvia should put itself self-interest first as well, which again is similar to Estonia. So that's what the Latvian media ecology was, that's the terrain. So what did the Latvian youth do with that narrative terrain? They were quite divided. They agreed universally that Russia is a big threat, but they had complete disagreement about how to respond to that. So some think Latvia can play a role, while others were convinced that Latvia was too poor and should be looking to reform its own situation and improve its own outlook in the EU before it's then helping Ukraine. There was much more negativity in Latvia than Ukraine, than in Estonia, which is maybe not a surprise. But it all depended on how they framed Ukraine. When they thought of Ukraine, they thought of war, then they thought, well, there's nothing we can do as Latvians. That should be NATO perhaps. But if they thought of Ukraine and they thought of corruption and rule of law and things like that, then they thought, well, no one can help Ukraine because that's their own problems. But if they thought of economic development, then Latvia could help once it's reformed or improved its own outlook, which might be in 5 years or 10 years. So none of those really suggest Latvia's going to be in a position to help. So that should say you can't reduce Latvian and Ukraine relations to one narrative. It really depends what perspective they're seeing Ukraine through. Finally, Lithuania. There's a nice sample. Ginteras has talked us through what the Ukrainian media were saying, but there was this sense in terms of narratives that Ukraine was at the crossroads. Things can go either way, depends on how it's supported. EU should keep a unified position and keep blocking Russia as much as it can. Ukraine is a victim, but Ukraine is still dangerous. It's not a normal state yet, but it's a potential market. So Ukraine is seen in lots of different ways, again, depending on if it's an economic thing, well, we can make some money, we can do some trade, but if it's military or governance, then it's more difficult. And again, as with the other two Baltic states, there was a sense that the world is uncertain, international politics and the big players are very fragile right now. We can't depend on the EU, can't depend on the US, and so there's a lack of trust in the system. Was some of the narratives coming through. So what did the Ukrainian, Lithuanian youth make of that? They agreed that the world was uncertain and in flux, if you like, in a bit of chaos. But again, like the other Baltic states, they didn't respond evenly to that. Some of them were, well, in an uncertain world, we should help our former allies and our kind of brothers in this region, and so Lithuania should help Ukraine. But others were, no, we've got to look to ourselves first. So kind of a similar schism to in Latvia, and to an extent Estonia. Unlike in Latvia, there was a real sense that Ukraine is not part of Europe among young Lithuanians, which surprised us a little bit, if I'm honest. But this was a blanket finding both in the university students and the high school students. So maybe that's a bit of a worry. But there was a sense that Lithuania, if it had a role, it would be to help Ukraine join NATO. Now that wasn't something that we were finding in the media, so where they were getting that from, it's quite curious. Why would young Lithuanians be thinking our role is to help Ukraine into NATO?
Did I understand correctly that some people think Lithuania is not part of the EU?
They
No,
think that Ukraine is not part of Europe.
Yeah.
Like
Not
European,
It's not a European state.
Not European identity.
it's culturally different somehow.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean, these are very thin findings from hundreds of pages of reports which we would welcome to share with you. So to wrap this up, we do see in some cases the young people are agreeing with what's in the media in their country, but other cases they disagree in quite interesting and quite surprising ways. And this is why we need both the quantitative and the qualitative, because they were giving us these narratives that they formed themselves, but then we were saying, why? Why are you putting this first? Why do you understand history in this way? And that gets us much more rich data. We're finding that the Baltic states, the young people in the Baltic states are very aware of the world system, the international system, and where they fit into it. So not just their position in the EU, but in the world. We found that the Lithuanian and Estonian young people responded in a more confident, in a ideological terms, a kind of more liberal, cooperative sense. That the uncertain world system meant let's form partnerships, let's build institutions, let's work at a kind of meso level, not global level, but not national level, let's form something in between. Whereas Latvia, there was a sense of we're still vulnerable and we kind of need to make sure that our standard of living is decent first. Ukraine young people didn't have that sense of partnership building as Lithuanian and Estonian students. They were more, we're in a dire situation here, and how do we build our identity, how do we build our security? So out of that, we're not really seeing much solidarity between young Baltic people and young Ukrainian people. Whether that's different to a generation ago, I'd be curious what you in the room would think about that. But that, for us, is maybe a slightly troubling finding. We're finding that, NATO are talking all of the time about, Russia's narrative or Ukraine's narrative or... Sorry? Okay. There's kind of this sense that we're in a world of the battle of the narratives, but it really depends what is being narrated. And if you're narrating economics, then the relations between countries might be very different than if you're narrating about security and military affairs. And then finally, given that there is this sense of Ukrainian crisis, who was offering a sense of movement? Who thought that diplomacy or partnerships might offer a way out? Again, it's the Estonian young people and the Lithuanian young people. We were discussing this with Ineta, and we mentioned this today, that the only people that seem to think that Latvia can play a prominent international role or have a foreign policy towards Ukraine is the foreign minister, who is not getting reported, is being ignored in the media. And that resonates with what we found from the young people. They just didn't think of Latvia having that international role. So we'll wrap up there. So Natalia, do you want to come back in?
I think since people are already here a little bit behind the schedule, we apologize for that, but probably it wasn't too boring and probably it was something thought-provoking. I think this team deserves a couple of questions. Would you like at least?
Sure. And on the applause the
Yes, yeah.
Ukraine and Lithuania are strategic partners, and I'm wondering, in your assessment, is there a problem with the strategic narrative of Lithuania towards Ukraine that the results are as they are, or is this more of a projection of narrative problem?
One answer. Yeah, well, I mean, we were finding that in Kiev that made more sense. That idea of partnership made more sense, but in Ivano-Frankivsk and in Odessa, and to some extent in Kharkiv, the idea of having partnerships, they didn't feel that. They didn't feel they were in partnerships. They didn't really see the world in terms of partnerships. So if Lithuania is saying we're partners, that isn't really resonating on the ground among young people.
It's also the other way around, we found. So Lithuania is very often seen as a very strong mediator or partner, but Lithuania itself does not see itself as a mediator or partner. So there seems to be a dissonance between what is expected or considered Lithuanian action potential to be and what Lithuania itself considers that action potential to be. It's both in media and in the social discourse.
Did the Baltic way resonate somehow? I mean, we saw the images and the acts and the video clips of it. Was that shown in Ukraine at some point?
That didn't fall within the remit of the media analysis, because maybe if we were doing that right now and we had a Q-sort, then it would be interesting to see whether that citizenship show of strength still resonates today in the way that obviously it did at the time, but it didn't fall within sort of the data that we presented to the students at that time.
How long did the typical Q interview last? 2 minutes.
Yeah, so what happens is we get the group together in a room, and it usually it maps onto a class time or a lecture time, because it's just the academic timetable, and we go through it then and try to leave as much room as possible for the actual discussion on how they view their responses as well. And those
So
are
they
recorded.
could hear what the other
Yeah.
people said?
Yeah, it's an interesting
That might
process.
influence and generate, let's say, bigger waves than would normally occur.
Well, that's an interesting point, because the Q-sort is a very individualized exercise. As I say, it's either somebody on a table putting things onto a piece of paper, or sitting at a terminal on a computer or an iPad, typing in and putting statements where they think they agree or disagree. So it's very individual. So that allows us to look at individuals rather than groups. Then when the analysis, then we can look at groups of individuals, and those groups were what Ben was presenting there, in terms of these broad narratives or re-narrations of what they receive are coming out. And sometimes largely we'll see clusters of opinion, not all absolutely identical, but clusters of opinion around certain themes. In the discussion afterwards, then there's always a chance for a group think, but the initial sort of engagement with those narrative statements is at the individual level.
And you didn't recheck after the discussion whether somebody wanted to shift their answers, or?
They're not allowed. They're not allowed.
It's a kind of complex process. We're trying to tackle it from all sides. So they have the stage when they're sorting the narratives. Some students do have a talk in the process, and afterwards we have the discussion where they're allowed to express their opinion. We actually encourage them to express their opinion, but we also keep in mind that some people will talk and some will just be shy, or their opinion will differ from the opinion of most of the public around them, right? So that is why we included also open-ended questions to this Q-sorting process itself, and some demographic questions, so that those people who would not speak out potentially would still have a chance to write down their thoughts about this. And this is another double check that we use when analyzing data. Discussion is important, but also that QL part, which we're using to extract different opinions sometimes. We really different from that massive video.
So an hour and a half.
So 1 hour, usually 1 hour. Yes.
That included the eastern parts of Ukraine.
I have a question on the mindset, the last bullet point. Estonia and Lithuania have that mindset. Latvia only the foreign minister. About the mindset, we have Gintaras was showing, and we did the survey last year in 2018, and one of our recommendations to the politicians for the foreign minister was like this. Lithuanian youth does not show great interest in Ukraine. But you here write that Lithuania have that mindset. That it's possible to resolve. Lithuanian youth is not interested really. And that was very surprising for us to find in our opinion poll. So, what do you think about that mindset and that is not even existent in Latvians? Because you have findings. I'm more like the political beast. I'm thinking in political terms and recommendations. So there's even no specific mindset. So
When they
but
rank-
to be very frank for the wrap up, what do you really see?
That they ranked all of the stuff about partnership building. The Lithuanian young people said we strongly agree with that. But whether that partnership building was with Ukraine or not, that really, they like partnership building, but they think that Ukraine is a fragile partner, and they think of the world in terms of building institutions and partnerships. But maybe Ukraine isn't the one right now that is the ideal partner.
But why do you think, well, in our survey, the older generations are much more supportive to Ukraine than the young generation, much more. So what do you think prevents younger generation to be more sensitive, whether it's their life, they're busy, occupied raising kids, or it's just new generation, they see the world in a different way? What do you think?
Obviously, I maybe take over here. It's the initial wrapping up in a circle.
Yeah.
That one potential factor could be a break of the fabric of interactions. This is the people born after 1991. It's a completely different education system. The different languages introduced, different literature is taught at schools, different movies are watched. Why should Lithuania look at Ukraine, right? And why Ukraine should look at small Lithuania? I'm maybe exaggerating here, but for young generation, maybe pragmatic choices are lying in Norway, or maybe the pragmatic choices lying in Germany. The same for Ukrainians, it's big Poland next door. And it could be generation, so it could be that shared historical memory with this generation doesn't share, or shares a different historical memory. That's what matters to them. But it could be about generation in general, the generation, whatever its name, Y, Z, X. I'm sorry for that. So the generation, the millennials, they have, it's a different generation, influenced by media environment, by horizontal character of media environment, by speaking lingua franca English, belonging to the world, thus the world matters, because this is their shell now. The shell is bigger, and that potential is another.
It's I can just compliment, it's where we come to these strategic narratives, to the narratives at all, because these narratives which we put the common the media, they resonate to the older people, they resonate to me, who are in the middle, but they don't resonate to the ones who are 20, 15. And so it's it's kind of, they need a different market. And it's very unique, the work of politicians, of media specialists, who are of themselves establishing their own.
Well, I'll have another observation, that usually when you look who are coming to the election, to the elections, and who are voting for the parliament, usually young people are not the main population that is coming to vote, older people. So maybe really the world is, well, their life cycle, in the life cycle, they're in a phase that there are other things that are more important. It does not depend on millennial you are not, but just until 25 you are setting the ground for yourself and you're not interested in something that is much
I think
more.
this is where the movement comes in. This is where the transitional quality comes in. Maybe we need to understand that the power of these transitional narratives also points to the fact that our political system doesn't equip us with this transitional narrative. And maybe it is not the political experience through going to elections, for example, but through partnership building by one-to-one conversations, or by watching a film, or by doing something, traveling. So the political participation process in that transitional narrative might change as well. And it's not, transition then is not enacted by taking part in elections, for example.
And or to support this also, but from a different side, when we were doing this Estonian sample, I was kind of predicting, considering the Nordic image of Estonia, self-promoting Nordic image of Estonia, that Estonian youth would be very pragmatic. But what I was very pleased to find out that this pragmatism is based on anything but not on the lack of knowledge about Ukraine. So in the first impressions of when you hear the word Ukraine, I think Estonian youth was the most diverse. They knew about everything, about Holodomor, about the war, about Donbass, Odessa. Some people visited, some people have family members and so on. They actually get the news from a diverse range of sources. So they are aware of all possible opportunities related to Ukraine, but they are still a bit more pragmatic in terms of taking the action. You know, okay, if Ukraine kind of grows up and makes the reform, then yes, welcome to the European Union, and then present this as fait accompli, something like that. So the point is that they don't have lack of knowledge of this. This is the beauty, because you know, my generation, I think I have a lot of gaps in my knowledge about, for example, Lithuania, and they are not. This is interesting.
And if you look at the last election in Ukraine, we actually do see traditional political participation. It's the youngest poll in the history of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Young people went to the booth. So, which suggests when there is something qualitatively different, a dramatic change, and it might spike traditional political participation too. And maybe Ukraine experienced that, and maybe more stable countries are following a different route. I may have to stop here. I have a power to stop. Thank you very much for everyone tonight. You can see that this project is quite multi-level. We've just touched on the surface, a little bit about media, about few sort about surveys. More to come, as I mentioned, we will interview young key informants, young decision makers, influencers. So we'll have yet another level, very qualitative, very in-depth, and very policy-oriented, literally in the second half of this year. And I will leave Irina with the website of our project. So if you want to follow us and know what's happening, VIPA is our contact here in Lithuania. Please come and see.
And you will put it on your website, and we will put it then on our Facebook. Okay, is that right?
Yes, please.
That would be great. So I think it's very interesting.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you for hosting us. And